Test, 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 1, 2.
Good. Hello, we'll get going. It's a lovely time to gather together in the warmth of this cold sanctuary. Warm hearts. So glad that you're here to hear from Danielle Thornton, who is coming as the Community Health Education Coordinator for NAMI in Minnesota. And National Alliance of Mental Illness is something that all of us need to understand a little bit more. The first time I heard about a mental illness a long time ago, I thought, can't they just think positive? You know, I mean, really, there's a lot of misunderstanding until it came into our family. And suddenly it's a whole different ballgame, and we realize how very serious it is and how prevalent it is, especially after COVID and the isolation that so many people experienced. So without my going on, I'm going to give this over to Danielle Thornton. Let's welcome her.
Thank you. Hello, thank you for attending this session today. So as Dix mentioned, my name is Danielle. I'm the Community Health Education Coordinator for NAMI. And really that just means I work a lot in communities to raise awareness as well as provide education and support for individuals struggling with mental health conditions. So I do want to say right off the bat, I'm not a licensed clinical mental health professional. I come to this space as a health educator, as a public health person, that's my background, and as a peer. So please feel free to ask me questions throughout. We have a small group today, so I welcome that. And I'll be giving our presentation called Creating Caring Faith Communities. So for those of you that aren't familiar with NAMI, NAMI is the National Alliance on Mental Illness, so we really specialize in 3 main areas. First one being education. So we do classes, trainings, things like that around different mental health topics, providing support, whether that be, we have a lot of print materials or research done around specific mental health conditions, the mental health system, so providing people with support through knowledge and things like that, or our support groups as well. So we help train and facilitate support groups across the state of Minnesota, both in person and virtually. And then lastly, we help to advocate for more resources and funding and all of that kind of stuff to help build our mental health system. So we work with a lot of our state legislators to make recommendations around policies related to mental health. This is my contact information. Yes. Sure, is this better? Perfect. Yeah. So I have my contact information up here. I also have cards, so if anyone at the end wants to connect for some continuing education or to host another session somewhere else, please feel free to take one of those at the end. We always like to, before we go into our classes or our sessions, we always like to share about some of the upcoming events that NAMI is putting on in our community. So one of the really big ones that we host is a conference, and this is on November 4th. It'll be at the St. Paul River Center. And this year the theme is mind-body connection. So really dispelling the myth that mental health is separate from physical health, right? We're all a human being and our health is intertwined. And so that's a really great resource that I encourage you to check out if you're interested. Like I mentioned, we also have a variety of different classes that we have for businesses or schools, and we also have a lot of free classes that we have open to community members. So these are just a couple coming up. We have a lot more listed on our website, and I just wanted to put these here. If you're interested in learning more, please come ask me after, and I'd be happy to connect you to how to sign up and attend those. So today I'm going to be doing our presentation, Creating Caring Faith Communities. So while NAMI, although is not a religious organization, we do recognize that spirituality, religion, faith is very important for individuals struggling with mental health in recovery, right? And for me personally, I grew up as a Christian, and my faith is something that is very important to me in terms of dealing with my mental health and well-being. And so I'm very honored to be here today and glad that we're having more conversations, bridging the connection between different areas of health and wellness and how it's connected to mental health. So I'm going to be going over 5 main points that we can all do as a faith community to better support individuals living with a mental health condition. And so we'll go through those 5 throughout this presentation. And we chose these 5 to really help just give people a little bit more direction on some of the things, the concrete things that we can do as a faith community, as just general communities throughout Minnesota, to better support our mental health system. So the goal with this presentation, and with a lot of our education and training, is to help create a Minnesota where each person lives a full, productive, and satisfying life. So we know a lot of people struggling with mental health conditions have a lot of barriers. Our executive director talks a lot about the fact that our mental health system isn't built yet. So there's a lot of people struggling that need support. There's a lot of really great support and resources, but it's not enough. There's a lot of people still falling through the cracks. And so this work and the work that we're doing is to help build up that infrastructure. And then lastly, our second goal here with this presentation and how you all can engage and be a part of this movement is to create a faith community that welcomes participation of all, including those who live with a mental illness and their families. So as I mentioned, there's a lot of really great things happening around the topics of mental health, mental illnesses. I think a lot more people are open to having conversations about it, but at the same time, our actions aren't always following what we're saying, right? Or it's easy to talk about, yes, we want to talk about more services and resources, but it takes a little bit of time to actually get there. So we're not quite there yet, and some statistics to kind of back that up. So the first one being 1 in 5 people in the United States live with a mental illness. And I recently actually just heard probably a more updated statistic to 1 in 4 individuals now. So again, just thinking about the community that you engage in, likely there's at least someone, if not multiple people, that are struggling with a mental health condition. So again, mental health, I believe, needs to be embedded in conversations throughout our entire lives, throughout our days, in a variety of different communities. So you can see here that a lot of people are struggling with mental health, and there's quite a few youth as well as adults who are still slipping through the cracks, not getting the right resources. So when we talk about youth, we see here 7 out of 10 youth individuals who have a mental health condition are in the juvenile justice system. 6 out of those 10 individuals are not receiving treatment, and 5 out of 10 age 14 and older leave school. So again, there's a lot of overlap between people not getting the right services and other struggles within their life. Besides just youth, there's a lot of adults who are also falling through the cracks. So we see here 4 out of 10 living with a serious illness are not treated. So still, stigma is one of the main reasons why individuals don't reach out for support. Oftentimes through research, we see that individuals with a mental illness wait over a year to actually ask for help. And so, the more we talk about it, the way we talk about mental illness, the more we can support individuals. Hopefully we can connect them to resources sooner than a year or even, longer past that. We also see that 8 out of 10 individuals are not in the workforce. So again, if people aren't working, they're at higher risk for a bunch of other conditions or situations such as homelessness, such as social isolation, kind of mentioned briefly in the beginning. And then lastly here, 1 out of 4 are in the criminal justice system. So again, there's a lot of overlap of ways that mental health and not getting the right resources impacts other areas of health and well-being. So the 5 things that I'm going to focus on today are right here on the screen, and we'll kind of dive into each one of them as I move forward. So the first one, we're going to talk about shifting how we see and interact with people experiencing a mental illness. Number 2, we'll talk about using respectful, accurate language. And then kind of going off of that one, the third one will be to actively resist disrespectful language and images in the media. 4 is to know the common symptoms of mental illness. So the easier we are to pick up on these things that someone might be struggling, then that offers an opportunity for us to bridge that gap between getting them potentially in a crisis to the resources that they need. And then lastly, we'll talk about creating faith communities that foster respect and acceptance. So I would bet that a lot of that within number 5 that we'll talk about, creating a caring faith community, are probably things that you're already doing in some capacity here. but just really reminding reminding ourselves what are ways that we can bring mental illness or mental health into those services or outreach or support that we're already doing. So we'll talk a little bit more about those things as we move on. So the first one, as I mentioned, is shifting how we see and interact with people. So right off the bat, we want to make sure and understand that mental illnesses are not caused by the person, their family, or their sin. So it's not something that somebody chooses. There's a variety of different reasons why someone might struggle with a mental health condition. And so it's a very complex thing to talk about. And so we need continued research to kind of help figure out what might be some reasons that people are ending up with mental illnesses. So some of the reasons could be genetic. So if there's a family history, part of it could be an environment, negative influences in life, such as stress, trauma, violence. Those can lead to mental illness symptoms later on in life. It could be contributed to chemical exposures, brain structure, functions, things like that. So again, very complex and a variety of different reasons that we can kind of see here. And then lastly, mental illnesses are treatable. So one message at NAMI that we really like to promote is the message of hope. So just because someone might be struggling currently in the present time with mental health symptoms doesn't mean that they're going to have to struggle the rest of their life, right? So there are treatment options, formal treatment such as medication, therapy, psychiatry, all of that kind of stuff, as well as other resources such as faith communities, such as social communities, such as practicing kindness and compassion that all impact how people deal with mental illnesses. So there's a lot of things that we can do as individuals within a community. We don't have to be mental health experts to support someone who is struggling with their mental health. So this graph here, this comes from SAMHSA, so the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration, and this is talking about the 8 dimensions of wellness. And it's a little hard to read on here, and so we're not going to dive deep into what it all says and reads, but basically I put this up here to kind of depict the different areas of wellness and how they overlap. And so it highlights different aspects such as emotional, environmental, spiritual, physical. So when it comes to health and well-being, when it comes to recovery of substance misuse or mental health recovery, whatever it might be, it's complex. There's a variety of different mentions. And when we're trying to support people with mental health conditions better, it's not just supporting them with mental health resources, right? It's supporting them in these other areas of their life. And so faith communities, church communities, can play into a lot of these different areas. So example, you will all have a large impact potentially on someone's spiritual health or physical health, if this is a physical safe space for them to be in. Environmental, occupational, again, so there's a lot of overlap when it comes to recovery, and it's important that we all are reminded of this when we're trying to support people with mental health conditions. So with shifting our perspective and behaviors, we want to understand that mental illnesses are illnesses. And so today in our society, like I mentioned before, there's a lot of really great things happening around mental health services. There's more money being allocated for programs, things like that. But we're still seeing a lot of stigma and discrimination within workforces, within places where people are engaging and interacting. So those things can look like hiring, within the hiring process, within renting processes. So for example, someone might not rent a unit to an individual if they know they have a diagnosed mental illness. And so this is just an example. It doesn't happen in all of these situations, but there's still a lot of discrimination happening around mental health within a lot of these policies within our society. And so we want to better the more we understand about mental health, the more we understand how it impacts people's lives on a day-to-day basis, the better we're able to respond to them in an understanding, compassionate, and empathetic way. So I teach another class. It's one of our suicide prevention classes, and it shows this video talking about listening is the power tool that restores hope to the hopeless. So listening is something that we can all do, right? Simply, listening does not have to be a complex or expensive tool that we lend to people or we train people in. And so hopefully after this presentation, you all feel a little bit more empowered of, hey, you are all individuals that can listen to someone. And if we allow people to fully open up and talk about their struggles, we can better support them. And so I always kind of like to mention that when we shift our perspective, we're able to approach situations and individuals in more compassionate and empathetic ways. The second aspect that we're going to talk about in terms of those 5 key methods that I talked about in the beginning. So the number 2 was using respectful and accurate language. So I'm not going to read all of these on the screen here, but these words you often hear quite commonly throughout normal conversation around mental health conditions. And so the goal here is ultimately to remove these words from our vocabulary. But sometimes it takes time. Sometimes we slip up accidentally. Sometimes we don't realize the impact of our words and how they're impacting individuals, especially people struggling with mental health. So the first thing here is just to try to remove a lot of these words. Try to remove describing situations and using like a mental illness as a description word when it's really not used in the right context. So for example, I've heard people say like the weather is so bipolar. So bipolar is a mental health condition. It's not a description word for the weather, right? So just kind of rephrasing our language and how we talk about it is really important. Having conversations about mental illnesses are very important, but also how we talk about them is just as important. Even if we're having conversations with someone trying to support them, if we use these words, if we use words that are degrading or just have a negative connotation or stigmatizing, it might lead that individual to kind of shut down more and not want to open up again. So obviously that's not helpful in this case, and so we want to try to remove some of that disrespectful language. So some other recommendations around using more respectful and accurate language. The first one that we tell people is to use people-first language. So for an example, instead of saying someone, this person is schizophrenic, you could say a person living with schizophrenia, or my brother lives with schizophrenia. That individual is not defined by their mental illness. It is not their whole self. It's a condition that they're living with, right? Just as other people might be living with heart disease or a broken leg or whatever it might be. It's a medical condition that that person is experiencing. Although I would always recommend people-first language in most situations, I always just say, don't assume how people want to be addressed or their condition. So I just say, ask them. Say, hey, how do you want me to address your mental health condition, if it's brought up at all, right? So always I'd say ask somebody first how they want it to be addressed or how they want to be named or called. Second recommendation is to recognize each illness as a different illness, right? So we can say things like mental illnesses or a mental illness, but really understand that bipolar, schizophrenia, those are going to be different conditions, right? And so people are going to experience them in different ways. And so we don't want to lump all people together and just assume everyone's going to respond in the same way when struggling with a mental health condition. And then lastly, avoiding negative language. So that kind of goes back to that previous slide when we had all those common terminology words. We can, hopefully shift to a way that we're not using those in everyday conversation. So again, using just more uplifting words. Instead of saying suffering, we can say experiencing, like I mentioned. Instead of saying lifelong or chronic, we can use the words treatable or serious illness. So again, really just promoting that message of hope when we're talking to an individual. The third aspect here is, as I mentioned, resisting disrespectful language and images in the media. So there's still a lot of media portrayal that portray individuals with mental illness as violent, right? So a lot of media will make that connection when we know most individuals with mental illnesses are not violent. We know from the people in our own lives, the people that we engage with, people with mental illnesses most often are nonviolent. They're generous, courageous, determined, inspirational, just as anyone else without a mental health condition is, right? And so if we hear those negative things happening in media, whether that be a movie, so there's been a handful of movies that inaccurately depict mental illness, such as like The Joker or The Shining. Those are just a couple that come to the forefront of my mind. But when we see things like that, we want to speak up, we want to speak out. And so if you yourself don't feel like you're the right person or you don't know how, like NAMI is a great person or a great organization to reach out to in supporting how we can, speak up about some of the things that we don't agree with that we see in the media. So just a couple examples. This is a picture of a donut shop. It's called Psycho Donuts. And they have different donuts that are named after different mental illnesses. If an individual is struggling with bipolar, for example, like how do you think that they'll feel if they see a donut called bipolar to describe this donut? And so this actually, I believe, was in Minnesota, and an individual reached out to the donut shop and actually originally reached out to NAMI, and NAMI helped support, sending a letter of just like their thoughts of like, hey, this is, disrespectful, not a laughing matter. And ultimately, the individual in the donut shop didn't take away the name. He said, go buy your donuts somewhere else if you're offended, which, he has the right to say. But again, the things like this, they impact people and how they respond. So it's important, if it does bother us, if we know it's not right, we want to say something. Another example, this is a product also that was in Minnesota. It's no longer in Minnesota, but these are energy drinks. So again, a father of a son who had schizophrenia contacted NAMI and said, hey, what can we do about this? So NAMI helped this individual reach out to this organization to say, can you please remove these? And ultimately, these products were removed from the shelf, but it wasn't because of the efforts of NAMI and this individual. It was because the names here were like copyrighted, so somebody else was using them. So again, multiple people around the country are kind of doing things like this. But again, even small efforts make a difference. And so if you see things like this, if you know that it's not right, if you know it's gonna be upsetting to another individual who might be experiencing these things, stand up, reach out. And again, it's something that we can all do within our communities. The fourth area that I want to talk about in creating the more inclusive communities is knowing the symptoms of mental illnesses. So these next handful of slides are just going to kind of touch base on a handful of mental health conditions and also a handful of their symptoms. There's much more than just what is here that you're going to see on the screen. But if any of these conditions are ones that you want to learn more about, NAMI does have a lot more resources and literature, and I'd be happy to connect people with those after this presentation. So when I talk to people about mental health conditions or suicide prevention, I always talk about knowing the symptoms or the signs as one of the key and important aspects of what you learn here today. Some of this might be a review, that's great. Some of it might be new, that's also great. But we first have to recognize somebody might be struggling in order to offer them support, right? And so if we're attentive and we're more mindful of people who might potentially be struggling, we then have that opportunity to be that bridge of support, right? So we have to notice these things first. And so even the quiet people, you can do this as well. So the first couple conditions that I'm going to just really briefly touch on, the first one being major depression. So it can look like feeling sad, irritable, changes in mood, if someone's not able to get out of bed. And typically these things are going to last for 2 or more weeks, or it's going to be a prolonged amount of time. So of course it's normal to feel sad, it's normal to feel tired or overwhelmed every once in a while, or if you have specific stressors in your life. But it's not normal to continually feel that way, right? And so this might mean that the individual doesn't have the right coping mechanisms or the right support to get through that. The next one here is going to be anxiety disorder. And so this is when intense worries or fears get in the way of daily activities. So again, having some level of anxiety, like it happens, we're anxious about things, but if it's persistent, if it's interfering from somebody eating or being social or going to work, that's where it becomes a little bit more of a problem. The last one here on the slide is bipolar disorder. So this is characterized by someone who is experiencing similar symptoms to depression, but then very drastically and very quickly changes to a point of mania. So again, it's this drastic changes in mood in a short amount of time. And it can look like risky behaviors, racing thoughts, grandiose ideas. A couple other mental illnesses, the first one on the slide here being eating disorders. So this is characterized by extreme patterns in eating. So if someone is, fearful of eating to gain weight, potentially someone's not eating enough because they want to lose weight. It can look like a variety of different things, and eating disorders are actually a very, very serious mental illness because it can lead to other very complicated, serious health conditions. The next one here, we have borderline personality disorder. So this can look like things like intense mood changes, stormy relationships, self-destruction acts. So again, these are just going to be some of the, some brief kind of symptoms with some of these. And then lastly, we have things like obsessive compulsive disorder, so OCD. This can look like unwanted and repeated thoughts and impulses. So for example, if someone is thinking about, hey, I need to wash my hands, and then repeatedly wash their hands even though they already did and they don't have a reason to wash them again, that could be one example of repetitive behavior that can be linked to OCD. We also have PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder. So this is when an individual is reliving a past traumatic experience, whether it be violence, trauma, abuse. So that individual is reliving that trauma in the present moment, even if they are physically safe. And so they're feeling those emotions that they felt in that past trauma. So they might be experiencing fear, anger, anxiety in the present moment, but it's related to this past behavior or this past situation. And then lastly, we have schizophrenia. So schizophrenia can look like things if an individual is having hallucinations, delusions, emotional flatness, inability to start and follow through on activities. The last aspect out of those 5 core key components is to create communities of hope and support. So these are just some ideas and some examples of ways that you all as a faith community can continue to support individuals with mental illnesses. So it can go beyond just formal medical treatment, right? So things like offering to help with rides or childcare, supporting these other areas of wellness. We talked about the 8 dimensions of wellness. What are other ways we can support someone? It might not be directly related to their mental health, but ultimately it's going to help them get to a better state of well-being. It could be reaching out to someone so they don't feel isolated. It could be encouraging that person to get connected to a support group or connecting them to NAMI resources. Or it could be putting them on a prayer list, right? So there's a variety of different things that we can support someone in their health and well-being. Some other activities or ideas around creating communities of hope could be holding educational sessions. So this one, great job there. But even just beyond this session, this work has to be continuous, right? Doesn't mean you have to hold a big, conversation every week, but how are you going to bring some of these ideas or this knowledge or this understanding into other activities within the church here, right? You can have leaders talk about mental illness in different conversations, things like that. Share resources, like if you have pamphlets or something, put NAMI resources out, put other mental health resources so people can grab them if they want. And then again, treat mental illnesses like any other illness. These next 2 slides here are just kind of pulling some highlights, talking about how most major religions or religious leaders have some type of texts that talk about supporting people who might be suffering or struggling. So I won't read all of them, but the first one here, the Dalai Lama says, all major religious traditions carry basically the same message, that is love, compassion, and forgiveness. The important thing is that they should be part of our daily lives. So again, we can do these things in every way, in our interactions, how we support people, how we talk about mental illnesses. And then I'll also point your eyes to the middle quote. This is from the Bible, so Matthew 25:35. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. Whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers of mine, you did for me. So again, just leaning even back on our own faith traditions and what we really believe as human beings, and being able to support those who are struggling. I was going to briefly share this video, but I couldn't get connected to the Wi-Fi, so I'll just briefly talk about some of the highlights, and also just to kind of keep us on time here. But recently, the Surgeon General, I believe it was last July, talked about the epidemic of loneliness that the United States is going through. And so he talks about in this video how 1 in 2 adults are experiencing loneliness. 1 in 2. That's half of individuals even within this setting. We know that loneliness contributes to many other physical conditions as well as mental health conditions. Loneliness has a very strong connection to depression, right? So one way that we can support individuals or prevent people from getting to serious bouts of depression or other mental health conditions is to create a sense of belonging, right? And so the Surgeon General here points out 4 main things that we can do to combat loneliness. So he talks about connection, so connecting with people face-to-face in physical spaces. He talks about sharing our resources. So what do you have as an individual that you can share with other people? He talks about listening, how I also mentioned that briefly in the beginning. And then lastly, looking out or reaching out for ways to serve other people. So parishes, church, communities, I bet already do a lot of these things. So again, how can we bring these aspects beyond the church walls, right? And create communities of connectedness and support. Social support is as vital as food and water to a lot of individuals. And so we want to make sure that we're prioritizing these things, not just for people struggling with mental illnesses, but to maintain wellness for other people as well. All right, so I'm wrapping up here in just a couple minutes, but some ideas that you can continue to do in your community here as a parish. Some ways that you can continue to promote mental wellness is to create a wellness or social justice committee. Perhaps you already have that, and that's really great. You can do mental health training, so again, bringing in NAMI staff members to do trainings for staff members here at the parish or other community members. You can encourage leaders to give different homilies or sermons around mental health. This is from Lifeway Research, and this is talking about just the amount of people who took this survey. They were talking about how often their pastor talks about mental health, and you can see the 66%, this was once a year, rarely, or never. So again, a lot of church communities aren't having enough conversations about mental health, but people want to have conversations about it. So again, just kind of keeping that in mind and encouraging people to keep it a relevant topic in our communities. Some other ideas to continue this work beyond just today. So if you offer interfaith Lenten soup suppers, you can have a mental health art show, you can host a mental health first aid for individuals. You can have a film series, have a discussion around mental health after that. Again, these are a lot of just examples to kind of get people's thoughts moving and ideas going. You can do offer homeless outreach services, and I was talking to Dix earlier, just a lot of you already engage in a lot of community outreach and organizations, so that's really great. So just continue to do that and incorporate those 5 things that we talked about and really censor that, that sense of community for individuals. And then one other thing when we talk about ways to create inclusive communities is to share resources. So if people are interested, they can actually take out their cell phone if they want right now and put these numbers in your phone. So these are crisis resources. And we're also I'm also very happy to send information about crisis resources that you can print out and just have them displayed here in the church as well. So for a lot of individuals, for adults as well as young people, the crisis text line is a really great resource. It's free, it's anonymous, it connects people to trained mental health counselors. There's also mobile crisis teams across the state of Minnesota. Each county has a mobile crisis team, but depending on the county and the funding, the services are going to look a little different. So making sure you know what county you're in and what resources are available will help. Hopefully, if you do find yourself in a crisis situation, you know what resources are available. And then lastly on the screen, we have the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, and that's the number 988. So a short number that hopefully a lot of people can remember. Again, it's free, it's anonymous. police will not show up at the location unless that individual contacting asks for that. So that's a fear that I know a lot of people have. So that's a really great resources as well. And this is just in summary of those 5 things we talked about. So shift how we see and interact with people with mental illness. Use respectful, accurate language. Resist disrespectful language and images in the media. Know the common signs and symptoms of mental illnesses, and then continuing to do a variety of activities to create faith communities that foster respect and acceptance. So I just want to leave you all with this short quote from Margaret Mead. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. So thank you all for joining me here today, and have a good rest of your weekend. I do